Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel chilling tales of deception and betrayal. Today, we dive into the twisted story of a man who killed 3 wives for insurance money. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, Robert seemed to have everything anyone could want. He was well-liked, easy to talk to, and appeared to be a loving husband. His first wife, Laura, was a kind-hearted woman who was equally adored by their friends and family. Together, they led a picture-perfect life, surrounded by the charm of their cozy home and a growing circle of acquaintances. On the surface, their life seemed like something from a fairy tale. However, behind this seemingly happy facade, Robert had a secret. He had a dark plan that no one could have imagined. Laura's death came unexpectedly one evening when she suddenly collapsed while doing routine household chores. The paramedics were called, and despite their best efforts, Laura was pronounced dead at the scene. The doctors ruled it a heart attack, something that often went unnoticed until it was too late. Everyone mourned her passing, and Robert, the grieving husband, was showered with sympathy. He was a man who had lost the love of his life, and no one thought to look any deeper. Their friends and family were convinced that it was a tragic, untimely death, and Robert's tears appeared genuine. He didn't show a hint of guilt or remorse. Life went on as it always had, and Robert, still young, eventually moved on as well. He buried his sorrow and found a new companion to share his life with. Only 2 years after Laura's death, Robert remarried. This time, his new wife, Teresa, was a sharp, independent woman who had been wary of Robert's past. She had known him for a few years before they started dating and, unlike Laura, wasn't easily swept off her feet. Teresa had been cautious, but Robert's charm and smooth talking slowly wore her down. At first, everything seemed perfect. Teresa was happy in the marriage, but soon after they moved into a new home, things began to change. While Robert had shown his caring side during their early days, Teresa began to notice subtle signs that something wasn't right. Robert was more secretive with his finances, avoiding any questions about their joint accounts and often making odd excuses when it came to long stretches of time spent alone. Teresa had her suspicions, but didn't let them get in the way of her newly blossoming marriage. Then, without warning, tragedy struck again. Teresa was found dead in their home after what appeared to be an accident. She had fallen down the stairs and suffered a fatal head injury. Robert was, once again, the grieving husband, inconsolable over the loss of his second wife. No one suspected foul play, and the death was ruled as an accident. Teresa's family, though deeply saddened, didn't think to question the circumstances surrounding her death. They assumed it was just an unfortunate mishap, and they allowed Robert to handle the funeral arrangements. He received another life insurance payout, which gave him the financial freedom he had been craving, yet he mourned deeply, or so it appeared. Despite the tragedy of losing 2 wives, Robert didn't stop. His thirst for wealth and comfort remained unquenchable. He continued his life, using his charm to win over people who couldn't see through his facade. His actions seemed to be excused by the community because, after all, Robert was just the man they all thought they knew. But there was one thing no one saw coming. Robert was already looking for his next wife, and soon he would be ready to strike again. Years passed after Teresa's sudden death, and Robert continued to live the life he had always dreamed of. The insurance payout from Teresa's policy allowed him to upgrade his home, buy a new car, and indulge in luxuries that most people could only dream of. He had become a master at blending into the community, his charm and calm demeanor masking the dark truth about him. No one suspected that he had already claimed 2 victims and was already planning his next move. It didn't take long for Robert to find a 3rd wife. Karen, a young woman with a kind heart and an open mind, met Robert at a local event. He was still the charismatic man he had always been, and Karen was immediately taken with him. She had been wary of relationships in the past, but felt a deep connection with Robert, who seemed to understand her in ways that others didn't. They spent months getting to know each other, and Robert patiently waited for the perfect moment to propose. When he did, Karen said yes without hesitation, believing that she had found the man she was meant to spend her life with. From the outside, their marriage appeared perfect. Robert was attentive and loving, showering Karen with gifts and affection. He had learned from his previous marriages to keep up appearances and play the role of the devoted husband. They settled into a quiet life, and for a while, Karen was happy. But something wasn't right. There were moments when Robert's behavior seemed odd, and Karen couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. She tried to ignore these doubts, but they lingered in the back of her mind. Then, just as Robert had done with his first 2 wives, tragedy struck once again. Karen was found dead in their home after what appeared to be another unfortunate accident. She had fallen down the stairs late one night, hitting her head on the edge of a wooden table. Robert, ever the grieving husband, was once again the first to call for help, his voice trembling as he explained what had happened. The paramedics arrived too late, and Karen was pronounced dead at the scene. The police were quick to rule the death an accident, just as they had with Laura and Teresa. There were no signs of foul play, and Robert's grief seemed genuine. He was left to manage the funeral arrangements, just as he had done before. The community once again rallied around him, offering condolences and support. But what they didn't know was that Robert's world was crumbling behind the scenes. He had once again collected a life insurance payout, and this time the amount was even larger than before. His plan was working perfectly. No one suspected a thing, and Robert was able to continue living his lavish lifestyle, free from the consequences of his actions. However, as Robert celebrated his financial windfall, there was something he didn't expect. People were starting to talk. Whispers began to circulate in the community about the strange pattern of deaths surrounding Robert's marriages. Some of Teresa's and Karen's friends began to wonder if there was more to their deaths than met the eye. It was clear that something was off, but no one had concrete proof to link Robert to the deaths. Still, the seeds of suspicion had been planted, and the authorities would soon take a closer look at the man they had all once trusted. As Robert continued to enjoy the fruits of his success, the whispers around town grew louder. Despite his best efforts to keep a low profile, a few people had begun to notice the unsettling pattern of his wives' deaths. Each one had died under mysterious circumstances, and each time Robert had come out as the sole beneficiary of their life insurance policies. These subtle suspicions began to make their way to the ears of the authorities, but without concrete evidence the police couldn't do much. Robert remained free, continuing his life as if nothing had changed. One afternoon, an anonymous tip was received by the local police department. The caller was someone who had known Robert for years and had begun to put together the pieces of his suspicious behavior. The person explained how Robert's previous wives had died in unusual ways, and the caller suggested that the deaths were more than just coincidental. The authorities took the tip seriously and decided to investigate further, even though they had no clear evidence of foul play. The detectives began their work by reviewing the details of Laura, Teresa, and Karen's deaths. They re-examined the circumstances surrounding each one, looking for patterns or inconsistencies. The first death, Laura's, had been ruled a heart attack, but no one had ever questioned why such a young woman would die so suddenly. Teresa's death had been deemed an accident, but there were no witnesses to the event, and it had occurred during a time when Robert was alone at home. Karen's death, too, had been ruled an accident, yet it mirrored the other two. The detectives could not ignore the eerie similarities between all 3 deaths. As they dug deeper into the financial records, they uncovered a startling discovery. Robert had taken out substantial life insurance policies on each of his wives shortly after marrying them. The policies had grown larger with each marriage, and each time he had been listed as the primary beneficiary. It was clear that Robert had been making sure his wives were financially protected. But it didn't take long for the detectives to realize that he had been making sure he was the one who would benefit the most. The police also found that Robert had been extremely cautious in the months leading up to each wife's death. He had deliberately arranged his schedule to ensure that he was either out of the house or unavailable at the time of the fatal accidents. There was no physical evidence that could directly link him to the deaths, but the circumstantial evidence began to build up, and the detectives were growing more certain that Robert had orchestrated the deaths of all three women. As the investigation progressed, Robert started to feel the pressure. He could sense that the authorities were closing in on him, and he became increasingly paranoid. His carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack, and Robert knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. Despite his growing fear, he continued to live his life as usual, outwardly unbothered by the mounting suspicion. He had gotten away with it before, and he was convinced that he would do so again. But the net was tightening around him. The detectives had already begun building their case, and they were determined to find the evidence they needed to bring Robert to justice. They were no longer willing to let him slip through the cracks, and they knew that once they had enough proof, they would finally be able to stop him from hurting anyone else. The investigation was gaining momentum, and Robert's time was running out. As the investigation continued to unfold, the detectives began to uncover a chilling new layer to Robert's actions. Their focus sharpened as they examined the financial records, finding more than they had initially expected. They learned that Robert had meticulously planned each of his marriages, not just to secure a wife, but to ensure that he was able to take out substantial life insurance policies on each one. This revelation was the key to understanding Robert's pattern of behavior. He wasn't just a man who had suffered through the sudden loss of 3 wives. He was a cold, calculated killer who had orchestrated their deaths for personal gain. The authorities discovered that Robert had taken out these life insurance policies shortly after marrying each woman, carefully timing the policies so that he could reap the maximum benefit when they died. But that wasn't all. The more they dug into Robert's past, the more they realized how far he was willing to go to make sure his plan succeeded. He had gone to great lengths to make the deaths appear accidental or natural, manipulating every detail to keep suspicion at bay. It was as if Robert had learned exactly what it would take to cover his tracks. Investigators found that Robert had even altered medical records to make it seem as though each wife had been prone to health issues or accidents that could explain their sudden deaths. He knew exactly what to do to avoid raising suspicion, and he used his knowledge to his advantage. Each death was carefully staged, and each was followed by the same predictable pattern: a sudden and unexplained incident that left Robert with a substantial insurance payout. But with each passing death, Robert had become bolder, more confident that he could continue to evade justice. The detectives now understood that they weren't just investigating a series of unfortunate events. They were uncovering a deliberate pattern of murder that spanned years. Robert had used his charm and manipulation to deceive everyone around him, from his wives to their families and even the community that trusted him. But the authorities were starting to close in, and they were determined to expose the truth. They began to put together a timeline of events, gathering evidence from each death and matching it with the corresponding insurance claims. With the evidence mounting, the detectives took the next crucial step. They began to gather witness statements. They reached out to people who had known Robert during his previous marriages, hoping to uncover any inconsistencies in his behavior. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. People started to recall strange occurrences, things they had overlooked at the time, that now seemed out of place. A neighbor who had seen Robert acting suspiciously around the time of Teresa's death. A friend who had noticed that Karen's life insurance policy had been updated shortly before her fatal accident. The more they spoke to people who had known Robert, the more unsettling the picture became. But the most damning evidence came from an unlikely source, one of Robert's future victims. A woman who had been dating Robert at the time of Karen's death came forward with crucial information. She explained that Robert had made comments to her about the financial benefits of marriage, suggesting that he had been planning his next wedding for the purpose of securing another payout. This revelation was the final piece the detectives needed to prove that Robert was a serial killer, not a grieving husband. The investigation had reached its climax. The detectives now had enough evidence to bring Robert to trial. They knew that they had uncovered the truth, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to make sure that he was held accountable for his actions. Robert had been living a lie for years, and the time had come for him to face the consequences of his cruelty. The truth was out, and there was no escaping the justice that awaited him. When the authorities had gathered enough evidence, they moved quickly to arrest Robert. The community that had once admired him now saw him in a completely different light. The man they had trusted, the man they had known for years, was a cold-blooded killer. Robert was arrested on charges of first-degree murder for the deaths of his 3 wives, and the news sent shockwaves through the town. People who had once been his friends were now grappling with the horrific truth about the man they had so blindly trusted. During his trial, the prosecution laid out the evidence against Robert in painstaking detail. They presented the timeline of events, showing how each of Robert's wives had died under suspicious circumstances, followed by the large insurance payouts he had received. They also highlighted his manipulative behavior, how he had carefully orchestrated each death to appear accidental, while in reality he had been the mastermind behind it all. The detectives testified about the financial records that linked Robert to the policies, and the witnesses spoke of the oddities they had noticed after each death. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when the woman who had dated Robert after Karen's death took the stand. She explained how Robert had talked about the financial benefits of marriage and how he had hinted at his intentions to marry again for the sake of another insurance payout. Her testimony was damning, as it showed that Robert had been planning his next move even after the deaths of his previous wives. Robert's defense team tried to counter the prosecution's claims, but they were unable to provide any convincing arguments. They attempted to paint Robert as a victim of circumstances, claiming that the deaths were just tragic accidents, and that he had been grieving, not calculating. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was overwhelming, and the story of Robert's cold-hearted actions had become undeniable. The discrepancy of the 2 stories was clear enough. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a verdict. Robert was found guilty on all charges of murder. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The families of Laura, Teresa, and Karen had finally seen justice served, but it was hard to comprehend the full extent of Robert's actions. The man they had known had been hiding a monster behind a mask of charm and charisma. Robert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described his actions as utterly despicable and emphasized how Robert had exploited the trust of his wives and their families for personal gain. As he was led away in handcuffs, Robert showed no emotion. He had spent years pretending to be a loving husband, but now he faced the consequences of his lies. The news of Robert's conviction brought some closure to the families of his victims, but it couldn't undo the damage he had caused. 3 women had lost their lives, and countless others had been deceived by his manipulative behavior. The case became a chilling reminder of how appearances could be deceiving, and how even the most charming individuals could harbor dark secrets. In the years that followed, the town slowly began to heal, but the memory of Robert's crimes would never be forgotten. His story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that trust and love should never be taken for granted. The women who had been taken from the world too soon were remembered not just as victims, but as real people whose lives had been stolen by a man who was driven by greed and cruelty. Robert's reign of terror had finally come to an end, but the scars he left behind would linger for a long time.